there's no reason. It seems like a reasonable thing to ask if you're cutting your belly.
I mean, I don't know how he escaped the spellcasters and the Grand Dark Mage leading the army, but
I'm not sure about that. I can't talk about that as such. I do know how he escaped that temple, though.
Hello everybody, I'm Pax and this is Brotakus, the show where social degenerates argue about why Goku should lose custody of his children. We believe you don't need a major in anime studies to enjoy this wild, beautiful, strange art form, and we are so lucky to have you on this journey with us. Today is another episode where we are bringing on people who actually know what they're talking about. I know, but give us a chance. Today we have on amazing historian Thomas Lockley. Thomas Lockley is an associate professor at Nihon University College of Law in Tokyo, where he teaches courses about the international and multicultural history of Japan and East Asia. He's published several dozen research papers and articles, including the first in the world regarding the life of Yasuke. He co-wrote the groundbreaking book African Samurai, the true story of a legendary black warrior in Feudal Japan with Geoffrey Girard in 2019, and is currently working on his first educational manga series. Straight from Japan, it's Thomas Lockley. How you doing today?
Good evening. Morning here. I think we're about 14 hours difference, is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. So thank you so much for making that work. We really appreciate it, because it's 8 where you are now?
It's 9 o'clock in the morning.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So, Thomas, thank you so much for coming on. Did I get anything wrong in that bio? I just want to double check.
You made me sound a lot more impressive than I actually am, which is kind of you, but yeah. Thank you.
I think you're not giving yourself enough credit, because, again, and stop me if I'm wrong, Nihon University is the largest in Japan, right?
That's correct, yeah. You've done your report.
And the College of Law is the oldest department of that, right? Correct. That's prestigious.
Correct. You've done your report. Well done. Yeah,
I have.
We were, as a university, we were set up in the same year as the first Japanese constitution, 1889, to provide legal scholars to be able to work with the constitution and build new law courts. Therefore, what became Nihon University at a later date was based upon the law school, basically. Now we just teach everything, and I'm an English and history teacher, or professor, if you like, and of course I have research responsibilities as well, and that's where Yasuke comes in.
Absolutely. What was it on your journey that kind of brought you to Japan to start teaching the subject, especially at a college like Nihon University?
I've been in and out of Japan for about 21 years now. My wife is Japanese. My kids are Japanese. Maybe one day I will be Japanese. And my wife and I decided pretty early on that we wanted to live here. We were in the UK at the time, but we decided to move back to Japan, and we've been here ever since. And as a teacher, the job at Nihon University came up. I applied and got the job. So that's how it went. I'd like to say there was a grand plan in there, but there isn't. But I'm very happy to be there as I am now.
Yeah, absolutely. So did you ever teach out west, or was your teaching experience centered in Japan?
I was a high school teacher in the UK. So was my wife, for that matter. We went back specifically to get certain qualifications that we would need to then come back to Japan. So we did those in the UK, and then we worked for a few years. It's always good to have experience of different things, and then moved back to Japan in 2009.
Do you find there's any temperamental or cultural difference between teaching students? Because I teach kids at a local drama academy over here in New York, and it's very different. But I'm curious. Of course, high school, college, different elements. But what was your experience with that?
I would think that drama students are pretty dramatic compared with legal students who have to learn English as part of their degree. So I suspect that we're coming from a different base. Also, I was teaching high school in the UK in what we call a comprehensive school. So that's a school where basically anybody can go. And here I'm teaching non-major English courses. and on top of that, history courses as well. So I suspect that the students are far more focused on the history than they are on the English, which is why I started teaching the history, to get them interested in the English. And Yasuke came out of that because he was always my student's favourite story. I have hundreds of these stories which I teach in lessons, and it turned into more history than English. In fact, it's now basically 100% history, but
Gotcha.
The students seem to like that, and of course I do as well. So, yeah.
Now, Yasuke being one of their favorite stories, I have seen a couple of interviews you did, one with Black in Japan, which was such amazing work that he puts out. And you talked about how there has been kind of a decade by decade cultural evolution of how Japan has interacted with the story of Yasuke as first as like folklore, but then as history and how it's been adapted. Can you kind of describe why this was something that like the students might have been familiar with before?
Actually, since that YouTube program was made about 3, maybe even 4 years ago, it was a long time ago. Mm-hmm. There's been a lot more research that's come to light. In fact, that Yasuke's story in Japan stayed alive for 50 to 100 years after he disappears from history. So artwork has come to light, which I didn't know about then, for example. And I've talked to art historians about a specific picture of him sumo wrestling, which was originally dated to just after he was around, but historians are now dating it 30 or 40 years later. So we've got that period of maybe 50 to 60 years after he disappears from history, where his legend in Japan it must have been huge for him to be the subject of artworks, and even one of them looks like a series of commercial products with his face on them, essentially. What we would now class that there's a brush case for writing with a brush in Japan. There's a gunpowder flask, and they have the same picture on them. There could have been hundreds of these products with his picture. So his legend obviously lived on a lot there. Then we come to the 20th century, where he comes back into consciousness because works which the Portuguese wrote 400 years ago, which had disappeared into mouldy libraries in the Vatican and places like that, were translated into Japanese, in modern Japanese, and therefore researchers could get their hands on them. His story comes up in about 3 or 4 places within this is a huge amount of work, thousands of pages of letters and other things. His story comes up 4 times perhaps, but it's good enough for us to get a feel of what he was doing during the years that he was serving Nobunaga. So this starts, and then in the 60s, an author called Kurusu picks up this story and then writes what is essentially an early manga. It's one of the earliest examples of a historical manga, not in the slightest what you would think of as a manga, but it's within that progress. And it was called Kurosuke, the black boy, essentially. His name is Yasuke, so she just changed it a little bit to base the character on his story with a slightly different name. And she's the first in a long line of people to do this, authors to change his name slightly or to use the name, change the story. So he's, if you're a drama teacher, you'll appreciate this. He's forcing drama into people, into stories through just his very being. And then we come down to a slightly more historical perspective in the 90s. He starts appearing as a bit part, of course, on dramas, television dramas, with Nobunaga or with Hideyoshi. He's just, nobody knows who he is really. He's the black guy in the shot. He's factually there. He would have factually been, but they don't say who he is or anything like that. And then you have the big one, Afro Samurai, which is based upon his vague story but set in the future of apocalypse, and that kind of goes global. It's huge. Millions and millions of copies have been sold. Animes have been made from the manga and everything. And so that brings his attention really into a global perspective rather than just in Japan. And from there, 10, 20 years, I don't know, I can't even count how many books and manga anime he's appeared in. And to be honest with you, I keep on finding new ones that I'd never heard of. It's dozens, it could even go into the hundreds.
Is there one that pops out as a particularly strange one that kind of made you kind of give you
there's
pause
one
for a
where he
moment?
appears as an American baseball player sent back from the future with a Japanese high school student who's sent back to the future to change history. So he's sent back and changes into Nobunaga. An American baseball player student is sent back as Yasuke. So that's I'm struggling now to think what the name of the anime is, but I believe it's even in English. So certainly on YouTube. It's mentioned in the book. So if you want to check it out, you can see in the book.
All right, awesome. So, audience, get on that. Drop the links in the comments. We need the source on that. I think that there's a lot of questions that I want to ask you specifically about the construction of this really groundbreaking book, kind of bringing so much more light on Yasuke into the mainstream. Because in addition to the book that you wrote with Mr. Girard, you also published a more kind of straight history in Japanese. Is that correct?
Well, I'm just fascinated by his story as a human being.
Yeah.
It's you couldn't make it up. It's just way too romantic and powerful. And I just wanted to find out more. That's what it started with. I was originally going to write a novel, but then family things got in the way, children being born, things like that. Careers needing to be made and money needed to be made to put food on the table, that kind of thing. And then a few years later, I had a bit of time and knocked it out as an academic paper. There was so much more to it than could be fitted into 10,000 words that I reached out to some publishing people, and they said, "Why don't you write it as a academic book?" So I did, and that was translated into Japanese. And published here, and it's still being published now. It's into about fourth edition, I think.
That's huge, because one of my majors was English, and I've read so many research papers over time. That's huge to get to like a fourth printing.
It's because he keeps on coming up on television, newspaper here, and every time a few more hundred or a few thousand books are sold, and the publishers go, "Oh yeah," and then they knock out and put a little advert in the paper saying third edition, fourth edition, or whatever, and another 1,000 are printed, and it's doing well, and it's good because it's bringing the real story to the Japanese public in a way which wouldn't otherwise happen, and I have to say that that has been entirely positive. The NHK program that was done recently is also coming up into its fourth showing as well. So again, Yasuke's story is a very, very popular story here, partly because Japan itself is becoming more of a multicultural society, and to find some antecedents, to find some times in Japanese history before when multiculturalism has been a lot more accepted, for example. So Yasuke's story fits in really, really well with this. And he's kind of coming out at just the correct time.
Yeah, absolutely. And yet I think that what's extra important that your book is doing is that there have been so many misconceptions about Yasuke, because although from what I recall from the book, he grew up amongst what you were pretty sure was the Dinka people in East Africa. Am I
Yes,
recalling that correct?
You're correct. That's just a hypothesis.
Right.
It's not fact, and we will never know for fact unless something amazing appears. We will never know for a fact yet.
Gotcha. But so Yasuke's early life, because I think often he's portrayed as a slave until Nobunaga gave him his freedom, essentially. So, but what was his early life really like, from what we know? Finding his way onto the ship, eventually going to Japan.
Well, first of all, I think the concept of slave has to be looked at, because whether he was a slave or not, he was the top class of slave. And for us these days, we think of slaves in rags, in fields, doing all sorts of nasty work. This man would have been dressed like a prince. He would have been bearing weapons. He would have been fed the best food because he was a bodyguard. And one thing you don't do is treat your bodyguards badly. Because you treat your bodyguard,
I guess I never put two and two together there. Yeah.
If you treat your bodyguard badly, you're likely to end up with no body to be guarded. So whatever we think of as a slave was not what you're thinking. Yes, it would be not how you figure Yasuke. It's highly likely that he was actually a free man by the time he got to Japan. Again, there's probably no proof because the Jesuits officially did not own slaves. They did, and they colluded with slavery, but officially they didn't, and therefore nothing is ever written down with... Sorry, a little bit is, but not a lot is written down in concrete terms. It's the boy or the girl or the young person, and that's a euphemism for a slave, often used in Portuguese at the time by the Jesuits. Yasuke is just called the black guy by the Jesuits, which again is maybe a euphemism for a slave. It may just be because he was an African, they called him the African. These things are not clear, and they're not meant to be. The Jesuits didn't want us to know that they were having slaves in the Far East. They didn't want that kind of thing to come out. So anyway, whether it's almost irrelevant whether he was a slave or not, because he would have been far, far richer and far better off than 95% of the world's population at the time, probably anyway. And he would have been a very honoured bodyguard of the most honoured Catholic in Asia. So by the time he gets to Nobunaga, he's already in a high status African. Then he just turns into another high status African in a different culture. For him, it would have been an eye opener, of course, but he wouldn't necessarily have felt any huge difference in exactly money. Well, no, actually, Nobunaga gave him a lot of money, so he probably would have been a lot richer. Yeah, he'd have been a lot richer. He would have had similar duties, probably bodyguarding duties, intimidation duties, that kind of thing. Servants in those days were meant to show honour to their masters. If you had a servant, that meant you were a big guy, and therefore the bigger and the better your servant, the more powerful looking your servant, and the better dressed he or she was, the more powerful the master was.
Well, and I think that's actually a great point to kind of hone in on the size and the power of it when he arrives in Japan. Around what we could figure like 6'2", whereas the average Japanese person was, I think, under 5 feet. Probably. was what was probably in there. And so, could you describe the kind of initial riot that happens just by Yasuke's presence in the square, and how this first attracts the attention of Nobunaga?
There's two riots. The first riot is when he arrives in Sakai, which is basically Osaka now. And they've never seen anybody like him in the capital region, in the center of Japan. And it's recorded that basically buildings collapsed, people were on roofs and they collapsed in, but nobody cared. They're just happy to see us. He gets up on a horse, they push through the crowds, and they get out of the city into the countryside and then process through. I think it's about 3 days. Don't take that as fact. I think it's about 3 days. They process through the countryside, and the night before they're going to Kyoto is Easter. So they celebrate Easter, and then the lord they're staying with, who's a vassal of Oda Nobunaga, says, "Nobunaga really wants to see you guys. You should go. You should go." So they go. And as soon as he enters into Kyoto, there is a huge riot. Nobody knows how many thousands, but thousands of people rioted, essentially. They barricade them eventually in the church. They're pushing at the walls. The church is nearly falling down around them. Stones are being thrown over, kind of like, bring him out, bring him out, bring him out. We want to see him. People are dying in the crowd. They're crushed. It was a big thing. But Nobunaga hears this and demands to see who it is who's disturbing his peace or causing such a furore, and sends soldiers to, well, we assume he sends soldiers to break up the crowd, because the crowd does break up, and Yasuke is taken to Nobunaga. Then Nobunaga doesn't believe that he's actually a black guy, because he's never seen a black guy before and has not probably heard of the existence of people with such dark skin, except for gods or deities. So he asks Yasuke to strip to the waist, scrubs the skin. Of course, nothing scrubs off, and basically Nobunaga wow, there's a real black guy here in front of me. Calls for his sons.
Which coincidentally is like the exact reaction that my black friends who teach preschool in Japan right now get from the children. Like, they still get the people touching the skin and being like, "Whoa, no way, what's happening?"
Yeah, that might not just be black people if you're in the countryside. That might be anybody who looks different.
Yeah,
but yeah, Japanese folk, especially children, are not shy, though there is a stereotype that they are. It's not offensive in any way to do that. It's friendly. It's meant as a friendly gesture. And I think most of the people that perhaps you're talking about see it in that way, or hope they do anyway.
Oh, yeah.
I remember in my early years in elementary school, teaching elementary school in Japan 21 years ago, having similar experiences, sometimes with the real small children, having like 6 of them jump on me at once. I'm better off in a university, let's put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, back to Yasuke. So Nobunaga just calls his sons. They have a party. And at the end of the party, he presents Yasuke with what is, I don't know how to say it in pounds, probably about 60 pounds worth of copper coins. Think about, I think it's a joke. It's just my interpretation of it. You get this strong guy in front of you, and you give him so much money he can hardly carry it away. See how much he can actually carry. And I suspect that it was some kind of joke, but it also makes Yasuke instantly a very rich man. So Nobunaga makes Yasuke rich, and then some point in the next few days, we're not exactly sure when, he enters Nobunaga's service. He leaves the Jesuit Valiano's service and enters Nobunaga's service. This is the point which people focus on. Was he then freed? Was he a slave? Or did it make no difference? I don't think it really matters. The fact is, he's gone from one very important man's servant to another very important man's servant. The concept of samurai means to serve. Therefore, in Nobunaga's terms, everybody was his servant anyway. So,
right.
Yasuke then is Nobunaga's man. Within a month, we've seen him being given residence. We've seen him being given a sword. We've seen him given servants of his own. Undoubtedly, he would have needed money. He becomes a rich man and a very respected member of Nobunaga's entourage.
So, kind of coming out here, because you've given us all this wonderful context on the relationship that's forming, this isn't like he just ran into some, senator or something. Can you give us context as to who Oda Nobunaga is and what's going on during the Warring States period at this point that is making this such like a fulcrum of history?
At this point, Japan has been at war for more than 100 years. Think about the First World War to today. Constant war the whole way through, armies going backwards and forwards, fields being trampled, people being taken as slaves, bandits in the mountains, ninja jumping around, pirates controlling the seas. That's Japan in 1581. Yasuke comes into the center of this just at the point when Nobunaga is sweeping his way through, killing all enemies. If you don't join me, you're dead, kind of thing. By this point, he's basically in control of the country. He's got the emperor in his pocket. The emperor in Japan at the time and today was largely a non-powerful figurehead, if you like. And Nobunaga is by far and away the most successful warlord in 100 years, and is considered as the first unifier. He was the first person to put the country back together after this 100 years of descent into factionalism and very regionalism, essentially. He's pretty much the most respected and loved figure in Japanese history today from a 21st century perspective. At the time, people would have been a little bit more hesitant because he did kill a lot of people. He probably has the blood of hundreds of thousands on his hands. But what he did was effective, and the peace that then lasted until the 19th century was built upon the blood of Nobunaga's foes, essentially. He was assassinated, and you're going to find out about that in a minute, because Yasuke was there at his death. But then his successors, two of them, Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu, finished his job, reuniting the country, and then put the country on a stable footing, which lasted 250 years until modern times.
Before we get to that really dramatic, wild thing that Yasuke does do at the end of Nobunaga's life, they formed this really wild bond. What do you think it was about their personalities, the historicity that they both brought, that made Nobunaga so comfortable around this outsider?
Quite possibly it's because of the fact he was an outsider, because every other person in Nobunaga's life would have been tied to Nobunaga through vassalhood, family ties, threats, etc., etc. This is a warlord. This is not somebody who has friends. He would have not really been able to trust the conversation of anybody else, because everybody else would have been yes men, essentially. This is a guy who, when he came home and his bed wasn't made, had all the ladies of the house executed, all the servants.
Gee, what?
All right.
Oh my God, what?
So this is not a guy which people would have said no to. However, Yasuke was not tied in with this kind of Japanese bond, if you like. He was an outsider. His conversation likely would have been accepted as almost friendly, if you like. Though I'm pretty sure he would have been very politic about it. Not saying the wrong things, but he would have been able to give experiences and talk in different ways than other people would have done. So I think the bond which we're looking at is the bond of an outsider being given preferential treatment just because he is an outsider and because he doesn't have the bonds which everybody else would have felt. And Nobunaga probably would have appreciated having somebody at least that he could chat with just about hunting, or what was the hunting in India like? What was the hunting Yasuke would have been taken out of Africa as a child, but he may have had tales of different types of animals, that kind of thing. And also, crucially, he would have known about war in other parts of the world. Nobunaga was a warrior. He would have been very interested in this. I would have liked to see a few more years to see whether Nobunaga actually used any of the possible tactics which Yasuke might have told him about. It's a bit difficult to say because he dies so quickly, unfortunately. But anyway, there we go.
Yeah, and do you think it was hard for Nobunaga and Yasuke to face so many warlocks and battle robots on the battlefield? Do you think that that was difficult for them to take out the android army efficiently?
Well, Nobunaga was pretty good with his weapons. I'm pretty sure he would. And Yasuke was his weapon bearer at the time. So I'm sure Yasuke would have had some kind of force field or, that kind of thing to make things good. Nobunaga, by the way, thought, or at least tried to make other people think that he was semi-divine himself. And many Japanese people seem to have taken Yasuke's black skin as a sign of semi-divinity. Because often Buddhas or gods are portrayed with black skin at the time and even today. And therefore, what's a robot here or there? If you're a divine being anyway, you just smite the robots or androids or whatever.
Absolutely. So in terms of the battles that actually happened and did not happen on the Netflix adaptation, these are, I think there were 2 or 3 battles that they were in together that we know about. Is that correct?
Yeah. Nobunaga at this...
Now, are they like engaged in combat, or are they like way far back? What is that like for them?
Well, Nobunaga at this time is engaged on all fronts. He's got enough men, probably well over 100,000, to be able to take on 2 or 3 enemies at one time, and to then put extra men in when the opportunity arises. And the first battle that Yasuke is probably involved in is one of the ones like this. There's an opportunity, some traitors come to Nobunaga's court. He pays them to give information about the ninja strongholds and how to deal with them. And Nobunaga sends in 40,000 troops, or he sends his son in with 40,000 troops to just destroy these ninja who'd been a pain in the backside for a while. Yasuke and Nobunaga then tour the battlefield pretty much after it's done. This whole region is pacified within days, essentially. There's just no competition. It's the middle of winter. All the houses are burnt down. Anybody that survived probably froze to death in the mountains. And Yasuke and Nobunaga are touring through to see the destruction wrought. And suddenly 3 ninja pop up with huge guns, large bore guns, try to shoot Nobunaga. And although this is not fact, it's not recorded fact anyway. Yasuke would have been there in that battle at that ambush with these 3 ninja. The ninja didn't last long. Nobunaga survived, although I think, if I'm right, he one of the musket balls hit him on the collar, but luckily his armor deflected it. So it was a pretty close thing for him. And several of the people around him did die. That would have been a bit of a shock for Yasuke and for Nobunaga, of course, and everybody else. But then they get out. The assassins are killed, and the region is pacified. The next battle is another opportunity, if you like, to take out an old enemy. The old enemy, in this case, Takeda Katsuyori, is in the mountains behind Mount Fuji. Very safe, very safe. It's very difficult to fight in those conditions. But one of the lords on his border decides that he's going to change sides and goes to Nobunaga's son and says, "Look, I'm changing sides. You can come through. Just come up this pass, the Kiso Pass, and you'll have this one." So Nobunaga's son immediately, on Nobunaga's orders, of course, immediately puts 40,000 troops in. I think it's 40,000, maybe 35. Anyway, they basically just swarm up this pass. And again, Nobunaga's troops come behind his son's troops. This is a different son, by the way. And so when Yasuke is there, and we have a record of him being there, so we know that he definitely was at this one. Basically, they're just touring the battlefields, which have already been... wiped. Everybody's been wiped out already. There's a pattern here with Nobunaga wiping everybody out.
Right, yeah. And to really quickly hit on 2, I think, important things that there might be misconceptions here. One being that samurai did not wear just robes all the time while they did their flaming roundhouse sword technique. There was the full armor here.
Yeah, 60 kilos.
Similarly,
60 kilos of armor.
Yeah,
120 pounds of armor. Yeah, fighting. It's a lot. I've worn it before. It's heavy.
Oh, really? Yeah. That's really cool. So one of the reasons why that was necessary is I think people imagine that these were all fought with swords, pikes, and ninja stars, but the sheer amount of guns in Japan at this time. Could you kind of give us an idea? It was ginormous.
Well,
right?
there's an estimated figure from the next decade of about 300,000 guns, which, to put it in context, was more than the whole of the rest of the world put together. So, you've got Nobunaga as the pioneer of this, and basically on Nobunaga's battlefield, there weren't that many. Well, there were swords, but they weren't used that much. They were right at the end. Nobunaga pioneered the volley fire. So you've got 3 rows of samurai, or actually not samurai, because samurai were the officer class. These are called ashigara. They're a very basic level of conscripted peasant, essentially. trained to work in 3 rows. The first row fires, they then reload. Second row fires, then they reload. Third row fires, and the first row is reloaded and ready to fire again. It's essentially a machine gun, but with thousands of men doing the machine gunning. All of these armies that we're talking about here were wiped out in that fashion. And that continues. That form of warfare was taken into Korea in the next decade by Hideyoshi as he invaded Korea, and they came up against the Chinese in Korea. It's the sad old story of Korea being in the middle of Japan and China. And so this kind of warfare was exported. There's no record of this in Europe until the early 17th century, so it's probable that Nobunaga was the inventor of this system, which later on went to form the basis of European colonialism. This form of rapid fire and form of mass gun use was what essentially marked European armies out from armies in, for example, Africa or India. So
that's so fascinating. The way that history weaves together like that.
It is. It's absolutely it's fantastic.
Yeah, it's mind blowing, and I think that thank you again so much for being on to kind of explain all of these things. And I think that's something that it's one of the most, I think, dramatized stories, even in Japanese media writings, plays, storytellings, and things. The fall of Oda Nobunaga and Yasuke's role in that. When this finally comes, could you kind of lay out that picture? Because I think most of our listeners probably haven't even heard of this before.
One of the key moments in Japanese history. You could even argue with huge effects on world history as well. Nobunaga has been asked to help out one of his other vassals who's fighting in the west, in what is now Okayama, so that's a bit beyond Kobe. And he takes the field again. He asks smaller vassals to get their men and to join him in the west. And he journeys to the battlefield with 30 key men, his entourage. One of those is Yasuke. They spend the first night in Kyoto, which is about 30 miles from his castle, and so it's a good day's horse ride, basically. And he has a tea ceremony with some members of the imperial family. They do poetry and stuff like that. He retires to bed, and in the morning, very, very early in the morning, he's awoken by the sounds of gunfire, basically, or rowdy crowds. What they think is a rowdy crowd. They're not quite sure why. This is Kyoto. There should be nothing going on here. This is peaceful. It's early in the morning. It turns out that one of these other vassals who had been ordered to muster his men brought all 13,000 of them to attack Nobunaga, basically to assassinate Nobunaga. You've got 30 men against 13,000. There's no competition there. They fight, of course they do, but they're in their pajamas. They are in samurai robes. They're in the flowing robes with swords.
Right?
They don't have guns. Yeah. They've just grabbed their swords from the side of their beds. They've grabbed a bow or whatever, and the odd spear. The other guys are coming in with guns blazing in full armor. There's absolutely no comparison there, and they're wiped out within minutes. Nobunaga goes to the central portion of the temple where they're staying and closes the door. Legend has it there were 2 other people in that room as he cuts his belly. One of them was Yasuke, and Yasuke, this is nobody can know what happened in that room, but the family which survived to this day, the Oda family, Nobunaga's descendants, their legend has it that Yasuke was asked to take his head so that it could not fall into the hands of the enemy. So if that legend is true, there's no reason. It seems like a reasonable thing to ask if you're cutting your belly.
I don't know how he escaped the spellcasters and the Grand Dark Mage leading the army, but
I'm not sure about that. I can't talk about that as such. I do know how he escaped that temple, though. He went out the back way. It's very simple. The attacker would come in the front. He went out the back. It's bizarre and it's simple. There are various records of how the attack happened, and essentially they didn't surround the temple first. They just came in through the gate and over the walls, but at one side. So Yasuke just went out the back and ran to another temple nearby where Nobunaga's son was staying, called the Myokakuji. Nobunaga's son had decided to get out of the temple into a fortified compound next door, and he had about 200 men, so it's a little bit more, but still not really enough when you've got 13,000 attackers. But they do fortify the compounds. The problem is that the rebels, the Akechi men, then commandeer a house next door, get on the roof of the house or the second floor of the house, and start gunning down the defenders inside from a higher position. So again, those defenders, this is Nobunaga's son. This is now Yasuke's new lord, essentially, because the lord is dead. The son and the heir is now his lord. So he's gone to his new lord to fight for him. They're all gunned down, and though we do know a few people escaped, it's not very well detailed. Most of them died. Yasuke did escape because then he was taken back by the enemy to the Jesuit mission house, the church, which was about 5 minutes walk away, so it wasn't very far. And then the Jesuit, the missionaries, give thanks to God for his deliverance, and that's the last we hear of him in history. There's no more written mention of him. As I said, there's these pictorial representations of him that carry on for quite a while, but there's nothing more written about him that has been discovered so far.
So how confident are you that the story of Yasuke does continue after this moment, that he wasn't lost at this point of time?
I'm not. He could have been wounded and died from his wounds. Of course, we'd all like to think that he had a long and happy life. Very few people in those days did, so it's not that likely. However, the fact that the letter which his survival is recorded in, the battle is recorded in, was written about 6 months afterwards, or dated about 6 months afterwards. And there's no footnote or there's no other sentence saying, "Oh, he died of his wounds." It just finishes with, "We gave thanks to God for his deliverance," kind of thing. And it's possible that the person who wrote it, who was called Louis Froisse, didn't think that was an important detail. But I suspect that he did live. What happens after that that's where legend comes in, because there are various mentions of black men meeting his description over the next few decades, and many of them are in situations which are conceivable that they could have been linked to Nobunaga or to the Jesuits or to somebody that Yasuke was linked to. Whether he was one of these people or not, we will never, unfortunately, know. Sadly.
And then we retreat into the realm of the imaginary, and we look towards Netflix, where Yasuke is still there, rescuing sweet Saki from the doctor's house and taking down the Catholic army before using her telekinetic powers to finally kill the Witch Queen. And so...
Oh, you have watched it?
Yes, I have.
I haven't seen it, unfortunately. I don't have Netflix. I would quite like to see it.
Yeah.
I've been told that story-wise, it's what it is. It's well written. As long as you don't take it as history.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
I don't think Sean Thomas was aiming at history. I think he was aiming. He hasn't contacted me or talked to me, so I don't know. But he was aiming at the fantasy, and that's what it's been produced as. I'm guessing it will be out somewhere where I can see it soon, and I shall look forward to that. But I do know, because I saw the trailers on YouTube, that it starts with him 20 years later in a bottle. Yeah, right? That is actually quite possible. You know, he was just in a mountain village. Whether he was in the bottles or not, I don't know. But just living in a mountain village somewhere, that seems plausible to me.
Yeah. And they do have, granted, it is a robot mecha army that takes out Nobunaga, but they do have the moment of the head cut. And so, a little bit of inspiration from Professor Thomas Lockley there.
Or from Yasuke's life.
Yeah,
I don't think there's any connection with the book. They're not allowed to say that.
No, I totally understand. Did you have anybody? Because I know there's still a movie in production. I know that Chadwick Boseman was set to star, unfortunately, his tragic passing, but that it's still in production. Has anyone from that team ever reached out for you on kind of like historical clarification?
I can't really talk about these things, but
Done.
I can also say to you that there's at least 3 or 4 projects on Yasuke that I know of right now. I've been told by somebody there's 10. I couldn't identify them. That includes the Netflix one, I presume. There's also smaller movies based on aspects of his life and a documentary, which I haven't heard about recently, but was being produced 5 or 6 years ago when I first started this project. And so, there's a lot of interest in media going on. That's only in the States. In Japan, there's been a documentary recently here. And he seems to make the newspapers quite often right now.
So why the story is still so perpetually compelling? We were talking about the way in which it, kind of aspires the new wave of multiculturalism and openness in Japan. I'm curious about what you find personally compelling about the story, because there has to be a reason why, so much of your work was put in. What do you feel it was that grabbed you about his life?
I think from the moment I saw it on a Wikipedia link, I thought this is too good to be true, or it reads like fiction, and I like fiction. I like history related or inspired stories, and this is one which nobody had done before. Is one that I personally felt invested in, and one that I knew other people were interested in. My students, first of all, but also friends, and then the general public. It was more of a mission for me. I think it's more of I want to find out more. I want to recreate this world. I've always wanted to write books anyway. So this story came along, and I tried in the book African Samurai with Geoffrey to recreate a world. A lot of the book is not just about Yasuke, it's about his world and the things he would have seen. So what did an African guy see in Japan at that time? That's the kind of thing normal history books probably don't actually delve into. But the book African Samurai does. It looks at what a hawking day out would have looked like for him. It looks at how it would have felt to wait for Nobunaga to beckon him or call him. It talks about what would have happened at the party that Nobunaga threw for him. How would a Japanese party of the time have happened? That was all researched. It's not. I didn't make all that up. That's based normally on menus or experiences written about at the time. Although I don't know exactly if the tiny details of what Yasuke actually saw, but those details did happen. Those things did happen. People did drink that. They did eat that. They danced in that way. They lived in that way. They loved in that way. And that was the key point I wanted to get.
Besides the role of straight historicity, because you did such an amazing job with your partner writing this great narrative history, what do you feel like for the average person when there is this mix of what we do know and great records, but still so many places it's lacking that dips in the myth? What do you feel like the role of history is, the intent in writing this book? What did you hope it sparked in people?
Well, this is not the kind of history that people normally think about. They don't normally think about cross-border history. They don't normally think... I'm talking here from an Anglo-Saxon perspective, a North American, Western European, particularly British perspective. They don't normally think about history removed from Western Europe or North America. Often that is, you can have people that think that they know a huge amount of history that know zero about Japan or zero about Africa, aside from its connections with Europe, for example. And in my experience, that's probably the vast majority of people with just a flickering of knowledge outside of those two areas. Of course, that's not relevant to Japan. Japanese people know an awful lot more about Japanese history than they know about other. But I'm talking about the potential readership of this book. And therefore, I wanted to show a different perspective on history. As an immigrant to Japan myself, I wanted to talk about an immigration story to Japan, which is an easy way in to talk about it. Yasuke kind of barges his way into all sorts of other stories and history quite effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. And not everybody who's involved in pedagogy is that interested in finding that story, touching that humanity, and creating. I'm curious, what do you feel like it is in you, just personally as Thomas, that you feel this desire to share the story, to work on the educational manga? What does that spark feel like in you as you kind of decide what to create?
Good question. I don't know. Adrenaline. I've actually never been asked that before. Adrenaline is part of it. You know, the process of writing a book, the process of taking a project from zero to end by the deadline, and then people reading it, other people reading it, is a bit of a boost adrenaline-wise. And I suspect that's probably at the heart of it. I mean, it's my job as well.
Sure, that helps.
Little benefit. Nobody specifically says you have to write this or you have to write that, but I'm supposed to do writing. About 1/3 of my paid for university time is supposedly to be spent on research. Nobody specifies what research that is. So my one happens to be Yasuke. I'm a very lucky man in that respect. I'm paid to do that. So that helps too. And yeah, I just like stories. I like stories. They're the basis of everybody.
Yeah.
Right? We all have a story somewhere, and some people's stories are happier than others. Some people's are sadder than others. They're no less compelling.
Absolutely.
I read the story about street children recently, and my goodness, those guys often die very, very young, but their stories are just as compelling as Yasuke's. Everybody's got a story somewhere.
What is if you could give shine to a particular book that you feel has been underserviced, something that you would really heartily recommend and get out there, but you don't hear a lot about, what would you throw out there?
I read a book just recently called The Japanese History in 20 Lives. It's by a British author called Christopher Harding. It's just out, literally just out. It takes 20 key people in Japanese history, men and women, and that's extremely key because most people just look at Japanese men. And it looks at their lives and it weaves their lives into Japanese history in a way that anybody can understand. And it presents Japan as not an exotic or a strange place, but just as is. And I've tried in my works to do something similar, but not as well as his. It's super. If you want to know about Japanese history, even though you know zero about Japan, about Japanese culture, about Japanese history, read that book. The Japanese, I think it's called 20 Lives. It's called The Japanese 20 Lives by Christopher Harding. I assume it's available in the States. It's certainly on Amazon, right? So it's available anywhere in the world.
Absolutely.
I got it in Japan, for heck's sake. So you must be able to get it.
Yeah, we will get that, and we'll put that down in the description for our European and American listeners if you need that link there. We have a lot of listeners who are studying Japanese culture, interested in kind of moving, involved in master's programs, different scholarships. I know you described kind of following life, and life led you here without maybe the most direct intent of like, this is the dream, this is to follow it. Any advice for people who are still pursuing that kind of pedagogical path, finding a teaching career, things that wisdom that you might wish that you would know?
In Japan or in general?
Well, actually, like if we could say in Japan, people who are interested, because all the time we get, I'm interested in moving there. I'm interested, would I just have to teach English over there? What are the options?
Manga is one of the best ways into Japanese culture, I think. So if you like manga, you're already getting there. Don't believe that everything you read or see in the manga is absolutely true, but see it as a representation of the author's place in the world. For example, what was the one recently? Kimi no Na. I don't know what it is in English. It was an anime movie, or the Studio Ghibli movies.
Your Name?
Your Name, yeah. For example, those are just everyday people's lives. I mean, of course, there's stories as well. They're like made up stories, but if you look at what the school looks like in those anime, if you look like what a road looks like, how cars look, what a shop looks like, you're going to see a representation of Japan, which is really close because it's drawn by people that live there and drawn by people that walk through those places every day. That's, first of all, going to get your listeners an idea of what Japan looks like. Not just the mountains, not just Mount Fuji in Hokusai's pictures, but actually what the Japan they will be walking through every day looks like. That's number one. Number two, if you're interested in a teaching career in Japan, after COVID's gone, of course, or after COVID has at least gone down a bit, I definitely recommend it. You can do it in various ways. You can do it through the government JET program, which is how I did it 21 years ago. They'll put you in a school or several schools. Sometimes you visit different schools and you essentially are an assistant English teacher. You're not a teacher, and that's important to understand because you're not qualified as a teacher and you shouldn't be a teacher unless you're qualified. That brings me to the next point. You can qualify as a teacher, then do it. And then you can be a proper teacher. And you can have a lot more control in your classroom and other things. Some people I loved it. I absolutely loved it to the extent that I married my boss. But that's a different situation. That's a different story.
We're going to have you on again for that one. Oh, my gosh.
Okay, fair enough. We can do that. Some people get very frustrated that they're not in control in the classroom. But from my perspective, if somebody came into my classroom that wasn't a qualified teacher and started telling me what to do, I might get a little bit frustrated too. So always remember you need to be respectful of the person whose classroom you are in. 99% of people really love their time it's called an ALT, an assistant language teacher. You can do that through the government. You can do it through private companies as well that dispatch you to various places. There's one called Interac. I'm not advertising for them. I have no connection to them whatsoever. I'm just saying that they do send thousands and thousands of people each year to schools in Japan. Then there's the other way. You can be a qualified teacher and teach in a high school or a university if you've got a master's or more. By law, you can't really teach in a university unless you have a master's. So bear that in mind. Sometimes universities aren't very fussy about what the master's is in. So it could be in a cultural related thing. It could be history. They just need a master's. Of course, it's better if it's in some English language related field. You're more likely to get a proper job rather than just as a temporary job. But a lot of people only want a temporary job. A lot of people are only looking for 2 or 3 years experience, maybe before grad school or after grad school, before settling into a more substantial career. A lot of people are meandering around. Do I want to teach? Do I want to go into academia? Do I want to go into business? Or about 1/3 of the people in the State Department in the US with Japan-related jobs have been through these programs. The same is true of the UK as well. If you're wanting to go into diplomacy, you want to go into civil service, it is a very, very good way of getting a window on Japan to take you there. Talking to the British ambassador recently, he said the fact that these programs exist is a great help, both to Japan as cultural ambassadors, but also to the world, having people who can be sent back to Japan as employees of their own state, the US, for example, and understand what they're seeing immediately without having to worry about extra training. And that brings me on to my last point, the Japanese language. You will always, always, always get far more out of this world if you speak the language of the country that you're visiting or living in. There are people here I know who have lived here 30 or 40 years and can hardly say a word in Japanese. They've done a great job. They've had a great career. For whatever reason, they've not engaged with the language. But I've met people who've been here only 2 or 3 years that have engaged with the language that have had a totally different perspective on the country. And I think that's very, very, very important point to make. If you're doing through manga, my goodness, you've got half the language already there in kawaii and all sorts of other things that just pop into the manga. That's a really good starting place to start from.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you so much. Your credentials as a teacher shined so much in that answer, because the impromptu question that I just chucked out there haphazardly, and your 3-point brilliant response of the in-depth, here are all the resources, here are the steps to follow, here if you're interested, here's where to go. That was unbelievable. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it.
It wasn't rehearsed. Thank you for saying so.
No, I know.
It's something I am asked quite often. So it's not that I've never been asked that question before, like some of your other questions, which I was not stumped by, but I had to think a little bit by. But I do really, really recommend, if you are interested, just go out there, apply for a job. There are lots of them going, especially in the teaching field, because languages are very much being promoted by the Ministry of Education right now, and some of the more modern textbooks that we're writing right now here and the more modern teaching materials really require a much greater interaction with speakers, and native speakers tend to be held up, rightly or wrongly, that's a different question, held up as good people to talk to.
Right.
And therefore, if you're many schools, well, they're mandated to, they have to have some kind of native speaker assistant language teacher at some point. But there's also private high schools that hire people full-time on full-time contracts. And let's be honest, the money's not bad. If you're going to Japan to work for a year, you can save money and use that to support your future career as well. So,
all right, fantastic. Now, I know that you have a job, you have a wife, and you have children, and so I want to be respectful of your time, make sure I could let you go, because you've been so generous with your time. Besides the Yasuke book and moving to Japan and enrolling at the university, are there any other ways for people to check out your work or support you that you'd like to plug?
Oh, thank you. You can go to Thomas Lockley Author on Facebook for academic stuff and to find out more smaller stories than Yasuke's, but still equally significant. You can go to my academia.edu page, Thomas Lockley. If you can do Japanese, you can type in my Japanese name, Lockley Thomas, and find various things there too. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and thank you so much for coming on today. This was an absolute dream, and your expertise and wisdom and skill at teaching, it just shines through. I'm unbelievably lucky to have you on, so thank you so much for making the time today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for being so full in your praise. That's really kind. Thank you.
Hey, your book rocks, man. You deserve it. It's so good. It's so good. You're so good at what you do. You totally deserve it. But
hold on right now. Thank goodness this is a podcast. You can't see.
Absolutely. So, I mean, for our YouTube listeners, please ignore this. But oh yes, I'm so sorry. We do simulpublish. Is that all right? We could make you a VTuber instead, like Hatsune Miku.
Don't worry, I haven't been picking my nose. I did flick with my collar once or twice, but that's because it's pretty hot here.
Right, just because he's styling in Japan, living a good life.
It's the thing I find about these things is when there's two faces on the screen, right?
Yeah.
The face always looks to the side, and so I'm trying to get it in the middle, and I never quite get it. So
because you could like stare directly at the camera, but that feels a little weird to you.
Yeah, right. So YouTube viewers, please bear this in mind. I'm not trying to stare at myself from a narcissistic point of view. I'm actually trying to work my way to look like it's natural looking at the camera. I'll leave it there. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thomas, thank you so much for coming on. And everybody, thank you all so much for listening. If you liked what you heard, please give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcasting app. I do not need to tell you all the buttons that you got to hit on YouTube to help support us, but the biggest thing you could do is share us with a friend or family member who you think might enjoy this, especially if they are a history buff, because this is a lot different than debating why Vegeta is a transmask icon or why Yu Yu Hakusho is a himbo. You know, this is an actual professor we're having on, and we're greatly appreciative of your time. And so, that said, I'm Pax. This has been Brotakus, and we'll see y'all next week. Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye. Thank you.